Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
My name's Marcus Hale, and long before I slipped out of sight, I was already disappearing from the person I used to be. I felt myself receding each morning when I woke beside Talia, searching her face for the spark that once bound us together and finding only emptiness instead. It started with small things, a half-hearted good morning, a flurry of unread messages left unanswered, the way her back would turn on me without a glance. I convinced myself that this was just a rough patch, a test we'd overcome with enough patience, enough love. But every attempt to reach her, to call her back into the life we built, seemed to push her deeper into a world I could no longer enter. The bed felt like two islands drifting apart. I clung to the hope that at some point our tides would meet, but I was running out of faith in the currents. Infertility had been our cruelest adversary. We mapped out our future in that sterile doctor's office, charts, statistics, hopeful hands held in trembling silence. Month after month we stared into each other's eyes, awaiting the miracle we thought would heal every fracture. The tests came back with the same clinical findings, nothing, again. The tears dampened our cheeks and soaked through our resolve until bitterness pooled between us. I watched the life drain from Talia's expression as she retreated behind walls of frustration and shame. At night, we lay side by side, our bodies a hollow space where intimacy once lived. Sometimes I would reach for her hand in the dark, desperate for a sign that she still cared, but she would pull back, as if my touch reminded her of every failure we endured. She stopped trying, first with the pregnancy, and then with me. Conversations became a string of stilted exchanges, each word chosen for its brevity, its safety. I caught her checking out of family dinners early, retreating to our bedroom with a book she never opened. I asked if she was all right, and she simply shrugged, as if she didn't know and didn't care anymore. I told myself it was temporary, that once we turned another corner, the life we dreamed of would reemerge. But as the weeks stretched into months, Talia's absence hardened into indifference, a sharp contrast to the warmth she once radiated. Our home, which used to hum with laughter and shared plans, became a gallery of silences that echoed through empty rooms. I tried every lifeline I could think of. I left little notes on the bathroom mirror, sweet reminders of inside jokes, memories of our first trip together, fantasies of our future children's laughter. I cooked dinners in an attempt to lure her back to the table, hoping the scent of garlic and rosemary would soften her heart. I even engaged in laborious affection, drawn-out kisses, back rubs that left my hands aching, the kind of grand gestures she used to respond to with bright eyes and a smile that lit up the entire room. Yet each gesture seemed to slip through her fingers, vanishing like smoke in an open window. It was as though the version of Talia who cared about my every whim had been replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone whose gaze passed right through me. The worst moments were those stolen pauses when I thought she might look at me, the millisecond where her eyes flickered in my direction, hinting at recognition, only for her to glance away before understanding could take hold. In those seconds I felt everything I once meant to her crumble, like shards of a shattered mirror reflecting back nothing but fractured pieces of a memory. I began to dread coming home, bracing myself for the bareness of our living room where laughter should have echoed and warmth should have lingered. Even our shared meals felt like obligations we grudgingly fulfilled, and I found myself questioning whether there had ever been love or if I had simply dreamt us into existence. Still, I held on. I believed that love could be patient, love could be kind, and love could endure. I clung to the notion that if I stayed silent long enough, gave her the space she craved, I might coax her back with my steadfast presence. But presence without connection is nothing more than a shadow, an outline of a person whose substance has evaporated. And as I stood in the cold light of our bedroom one morning, brushing my teeth while Talia dressed for work across the hall without a word, I realized that shadow had grown too heavy to carry. Something essential was already missing, swallowed by too many unanswered questions and too few shared moments. I stared at my reflection, the hollow-eyed man looking back at me, and recognized that I was no longer the husband she once cherished. Infertility had tested us. Her sister's arrival had strained us further, but it was indifference that finished the job. The person Talia used to be, the woman who dreamed with me, fought with me, loved me fiercely, had become a stranger drifting through our life without ever looking my way. And in that reflection, I saw that I was fading too, dissolving into the background of a story that no longer felt like mine. It was in that quiet surrender that I understood the only path forward. Reclaiming myself meant first acknowledging that something precious was already gone. In the emptiness left behind, I felt the first stirrings of a different decision, one that would irrevocably change the course of both our lives. Raina arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon, her dusty sedan rolling up our driveway with enough force to rattle the flower pots on the porch. She stepped out in leggings stretched tight over a round belly that didn't belong to her, dragging 2 small suitcases behind her. Her kids, Jasmine and Nico, burst out of the backseat like restless fireflies, their laughter echoing against the siding of the house I once loved. Talia greeted her at the door with a hug I don't remember ever seeing from me, and in that instant I understood. Our home was no longer just ours. It had expanded to include her sister's chaos, her sister's drama, and it had squeezed me right into a corner. I watched as Raina swept through the living room, tossing a pile of mismatched shoes by the couch and unstacking toys with surgical precision. Within minutes, she had a fortress of plastic blocks and stuffed animals covering the floor, a rainbow of art supplies littering the coffee table, and 2 sticky-handed children vying for her attention. I felt the slick slide of resentment pooling in my gut, but I forced a smile for Talia's sake, for the memory of what this place used to be. I offered to help unpack a box of books, but Raina brushed me aside, her smile too bright, her eyes too knowing, as if she reveled in squeezing me out. When she finally turned to me, she said, "Thanks, Mr. Tense, but I've got this." I forced a laugh, hoping she would feel the joke was meant to be kind, but instead she rolled her eyes and marched on, leaving me stranded among the building blocks and cheerfully forgotten. Night fell with me perched on the couch, my spot taken by a stray pillow marked with juice stains. Talia had set up Raina in our room, tucking her into the bed where I had memorized every curve of Talia's shoulder. I lay under a thin blanket, the creak of springs beneath me unfamiliar and unforgiving. The ceiling fan spun lazily above, stirring the dim hum of my own frustrations. I closed my eyes and tried to block out the muffled giggles from down the hall, but each echo drilled into my mind. This was no longer my sanctuary. I remembered telling Talia once that a house becomes a home when 2 people fill it with memories. Now it felt like a stranger's apartment where I was just a guest, and a poorly treated one at that. Breakfast the next morning was a carnival. Pancakes shaped like cartoon characters, cereal in colors I couldn't name, and the sweet scent of boxed syrup that stuck to the counter minutes after the kids had scampered off to play. Raina flitted around the kitchen, her tone bright and sing-song as she barked orders at her children. "Eat up, Nico. Jasmine, don't spill the milk on Talia's new rug." My presence went unremarked, as if I were a houseplant absorbing all my energy without offering anything in return. I poured coffee into a chipped mug and sipped it bitterly, watching Raina lean in close to Talia and whisper conspiratorially. Their laughter rang out, a private chord I could never join. I realized then that my role in this house had been reduced to background noise, a fixture so persistent it was easier to ignore than confront. I tried to talk to Talia that afternoon, hoping to reclaim a sliver of our former connection. I stood in the hallway while Raina supervised homework at the dining table, each flash of her phone and click of her tongue a metronome counting down my relevance. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice soft but trembling with the weight of unsaid things. Talia glanced up from her phone, her eyes skimming over me like she was scanning an ad she didn't plan to read. She sighed, set her phone aside, and turned her chair toward me. I braced myself, ready to speak my heart, to tell her how invisible she'd made me feel. But before I could begin, Raina interjected, "Make sure he doesn't steal your chair, Talia," and laughed as the kids joined in. Talia chuckled too, and I folded my arms, shrinking inside a shell of bruised pride. I left the attempt unfinished. My words stayed lodged in my throat, silenced by the reality that Talia's loyalty lay squarely with her sister. Every knock at the door for a delivery or friend's visit began with Raina's greeting, "Never mind." I became the silent specter who paid the bills but couldn't claim a corner of the living space I had once proudly shared. The couch gave me backache, the thin blanket left me shivering, and worse, it left me questioning whether I still mattered in this tangled portrait of family I could no longer recognize. One evening, I found myself in the backyard, nursing a beer while the kids chased fireflies in the dusk. The sky was painted in bruised purples, and the cicadas droned like a distant crowd cheering for someone else. Talia stepped out behind me, closing the sliding door with a careless flick of her wrist. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching the children with soft eyes. For a moment, I thought she might see me standing there, really see me, so I turned and met her gaze. But she looked past me, focusing only on her sister's little angels, as if I were a tree behind her, essential for shade but otherwise dispensable. That night, I lay awake listening to the patter of tiny feet in the hallway and the low hum of voices hushed in sisterly secrets. I realized fear had replaced the worry I once felt about losing Talia's love. Now I feared I had already lost her entirely to a version of family I didn't belong to. And yet, despite the ache in my chest, there gleamed a stubborn ember of resolve, an urgent whisper insisting that a life lived in the margins was no life at all. I closed my eyes and vowed that someday, I would either reclaim my place or find a new story to inhabit, one where I was more than just the guest who never left. I used to think a home was defined by the walls and the roof, by the furniture you arranged and the art you hung, but Raina taught me otherwise. She turned our living room into her personal playground, scattering her kids' laughter and their toys everywhere like confetti. The first time I tried to claim a spot on the couch, a plastic dinosaur lodged between the cushions bit back, and I found myself navigating an obstacle course of blocks and crayons just to sit down. I flinched at the shrill bark of Dad 2.0 hollered from the kitchen, where Raina and her minions were carving a pancake masterpiece shaped like a unicorn. Talia's stifled giggle followed, sharp as broken glass. In that moment, the couch and I reached a quiet agreement. It no longer belonged to me. Raina's children became the household's heartbeat, and I felt like an expired battery. I was there, but only to power her narrative. Each morning I tiptoe past their bedroom door, careful not to disturb their cartoons or their whining, and head to the kitchen to find my coffee cup occupied by a half-finished art project, googly eyes glued crookedly onto a paper plate. I swallowed the lump in my throat and made fresh coffee, sliding the mug toward me as though it would materialize the respect I'd lost. Raina would breeze in, one hand on her hip, the other carrying Nico, and lift the mug without a word, gulping down the bitter liquid as if it were my owed attention. I spent evenings in the garage whenever I could. The scent of sawdust and turpentine offered a salve for my bruised ego. I picked up my old chisels and sanded scrapwood, imagining I was carving out a space where I still mattered. Occasionally, I'd hear Raina's voice echo through the walls as she teased Talia about my man cave and how I used to spend more time here than with my own wife. Each jab surrendered part of me, another plank removed from the foundation of my identity. Yet, in the lone brightness of my garage lamp, I still found something of myself, a man who could create, who could shape raw potential into something purposeful. It was the only place left in the house where I wasn't just background noise. One afternoon, I joined them at the dining table under the guise of monitoring the kids' drawing contest. Raina handed me a crayon with a patronizing smile. Here, Mr. Artist, try staying inside the lines. The children giggled, their sticky fingers dipping into the crayon box as if I were a museum exhibit to be examined. I pretended to draw alongside them, tracing shapes I didn't care to finish, while a storm brewed inside my chest. I realized then that silence can be as deadly as any insult. Every time they ignored my slightest attempt to connect, every time Talia's eyes flicked past me as if I were a sliver of dust on her lens, they were chiseling me out of the story of our lives. That night, after the kids were tucked into their bunk beds and the house exhaled into stillness, I wandered back into the living room. The space looked hollow, drained of the warmth it once possessed. I pressed my palm against the armrest that used to bear the weight of my conversations with Talia, the place we'd shared jokes and plotted our future. Now it bore only the faint outline of my abandonment. I sat there and closed my eyes, listening for echoes of my own voice, for the echo of my presence. There was nothing but the distant hum of the refrigerator and the steady beating of my heart, reminding me I was still alive, still standing, amid everything that had pushed me aside. In the darkness, I made a decision. I would no longer drift through my own life as though I were a ghost. The soreness in my shoulders, the ache in my chest, and the tingle in my fingertips when I held my chisel, all of it reminded me that I existed beyond Talia's indifference and Raina's mockery. I resolved that if I could not reclaim my rightful place in this house, I would build my own space where I mattered. The next day, I would ask Raina to respect my presence. Or else I would remind them all why absence can be as powerful as presence. I stood, brushed off imaginary dust, and felt the weight of possibility settle in my bones for the first time in months. I would no longer be background noise in my own story. I pulled onto the gravel driveway that afternoon, the familiar crunch of stones under my tires feeling more jarring than comforting. Smoke curled from the backyard grills, carrying the tang of char and spices through the open windows of my car. Laughter floated across the yard like drifting embers, and I hesitated in the threshold, half expecting someone to rush over with outstretched arms or an embarrassed apology. Instead, I heard only the hum of conversation, snapshots of family chatter that didn't include me. I took a breath, straightened my shoulders, and stepped into the fray. Raina's kids darted past me, hot dog buns in hand, squealing about jelly beans they'd stowed in their pockets. Talia greeted me with a polite smile, as though I were a neighbor rather than the man she married. Her father barked a greeting without waiting for a response, then swept back inside to check on the homemade coleslaw. I offered to help carry a tray of baked beans, an olive branch, or at least an attempt to claim some part of this day that had been planned behind my back. But Raina shot me a sharp look and intercepted my reach. "Dad's got it," she chirped, slipping the dish into her arms as if it were a prize she'd won by pushing me aside. I found the empty picnic table at the edge of the yard where Talia and I had once planned our vacations, spread a red-checked cloth over the slats, and placed my plate in front of me. I watched cousins chase one another around the pool, watched my reflection in the vodka barrel cooler, and felt the void in my chest widen. The sun beat down on my neck, and sweat gathered at the hairline, but I sat still, unwilling to let my anger or my hurt show. I sipped my soda and pretended the conversation around me was mere background noise. I could almost believe I was invisible until I realized everyone around the table was poised, waiting for my reaction. That's when Jasper stepped forward, his grin wide and self-satisfied. He raised his red solo cup high above his head as if he were offering a toast to a champion. "If Marcus disappeared tomorrow," he called, voice booming over the chatter, "no one would even notice." Laughter burst out around him like fireworks, igniting familiar faces and fits of amusement. Talia slumped against the cooler, doubling over as if a physical pain had stolen her breath. My plate trembled in my hand as beans sloshed against the rim. I swallowed the ache in my throat and looked Jasper in the eye. He stood there, triumphant, as though he had just won some perverse contest. I imagined the words rattling around in his skull, a taunt he didn't even realize was a confession. In that moment, the world narrowed to the distance between us. The picnic table, the hovering guests, the sizzling grill behind him. He had to know I heard him. Talia laughed too loudly at his joke. No one bothered to apologize or steer the joke back to neutral ground. Their silence screamed indifference. I reached for a hot dog, cold but salvageable, and held it out like a chalice. My arm stretched across the table, and the bun felt weighty in my hand, an unexpected scepter I hadn't planned to raise that day. The laughter waned as eyes turned toward me, puzzled by the sudden shift in atmosphere. I took a breath, lifted my hot dog as though it were a trophy, and said in a calm voice that carried across the lawn, "Challenge accepted." The pause hit like a thunderclap. Jasper's grin flickered. Talia's eyes shot to mine, confusion and something else, recognition, warring behind her lashes. The cousins froze mid-chase. Even the kids stopped tugging at each other to peer my way. My voice hovered in the midday heat, ringing with unintended finality. I saw every face register the quiet power of that moment, not mockery or punishment, but a declaration, a statement of self-preservation. Then I lowered my hand, took a bite, and chewed deliberately, savoring the blandness and the absurdity of it all. The crunch of the bun and the snap of the sausage under my teeth felt like resetting a broken compass. Attention lingered on me, suspended between shock and curiosity, but I refused to give them any more than that. I met Talia's gaze and held it, letting her see the man she'd ignored for too long, the man who was done being overlooked. I chewed another bite, savoring the simple act of eating as though it were the most defiant thing I'd ever done. The bubbles from my soda rose in my glass, shimmering like a promise that change was inevitable. Slowly, the sounds of the barbecue crept back, children shrieking in delight, the crackle of the grill, the low hum of conversation, but I felt a barrier between their world and mine. The barrier felt good, like skin tight against the chill of new resolve. When I finished the hot dog, I pushed my plate away and stood. The shifting gravel beneath my shoes felt grounding, real. I wiped my hands on the cloth and met every pair of eyes with a stillness that belonged to a man who has finally recognized his own value. I gave no further explanation. I nodded politely to the adults I passed and offered a gentle, almost imperceptible head tilt to the kids as I walked through the crowd. I wasn't angry. I wasn't begging for pity. I was simply claiming my right to be seen. Later that night, as I lay in bed that wasn't mine, I replayed the moment over and over. The hot dog, once an innocent snack, had become my sword, a symbol of refusal to blend into the scenery any longer. I realized that the world I left behind had been defined by others' expectations and neglect. But in those few seconds, holding that hot dog aloft, I found the clarity I needed. I would vanish on my own terms, not because they erased me, but because I chose to reclaim myself. And with that promise warming my chest, I closed my eyes, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. That night, after the last embers in the backyard fire pit had died to ash and the distant hum of cicadas lulled the neighborhood to a heavy silence, I crept back into the house I once called home. The floorboards groaned under my bare feet as I made my way through the darkened living room, past the piles of toys and forgotten art supplies, toward the door of our bedroom. I paused at the threshold, inhaling the stale scent of stale laughter and stale love, as if I could bottle it one last time. Inside, Talia's sister Raina snored softly, sprawled across the bed in my wife's clothes, children's blankets tangled around her. I closed the door gently behind me and leaned against the cool wood, fingertips tracing the outline of the knob. In the dim glow of the hallway night light, I opened the closet. Rows of shirts hung in neat succession, their collars crisp, their sleeves unwrinkled, mocking me with the promise of a life I no longer fit into. I selected a few, my favorite navy button-down, a soft gray sweater, 2 dress shirts for interviews I would never attend here again. On the top shelf lay my passport, tucked away in a leather sheath, its worn edges a testament to trips taken alone with Talia by my side. I retrieved it and placed it in the suitcase. Next came my laptop, a lifeline I would rebuild my career upon, its charger coiled beside it. I slipped in a stack of notebooks, each filled with journals in which I had poured my doubts and my dreams, hoping one day they would lead me back to someone who truly cared. My father's watch was the last to go in. He had given it to me on my 21st birthday, engraving on the back a simple message: "Time defines us." I closed my eyes as I held it, feeling the metal cool beneath my fingertips. I had spent so many hours losing track of time here, watching it slip through my fingers in silent cruelty. Now, I would let it guide me forward. I wound it and slipped it onto my wrist, letting the steady tick-tock sync with the beating of my heart. On the dresser lay our signed divorce papers, crisp and white like a fresh start, waiting to be addressed. I picked up the top sheet and, with a practiced hand, lifted a sticky note that read, "You noticed yet?" The challenge I had written myself, a quiet dare to both of us. I unfolded the papers and placed them on the edge of the counter where Talia would find them at sunrise, right next to a folded photograph of us in happier times, smiling at the camera on our honeymoon. I hesitated. I was tracing the curve of my younger self's grin, and felt a pang of regret and relief entwined. Then I left the photo face up, a silent reminder that memory too could be a farewell gift. I zipped the suitcase shut and walked outside under the veil of midnight, the air cool against my bare arms. The front door closed behind me with a soft click that echoed like the final note in a song I had played too many times. I paused on the porch, taking in the row of homes sleeping under streetlights, each window a separate world that also held untold stories. I slung the bag over my shoulder and took a final step down the walkway, leaving footprints that would soon fade with the morning dew. The car started on the first turn of the key. I turned off my headlights and eased into the night, steering toward the highway that led away from the life I had known. At the stop sign, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house standing still in the shadow of an oak tree, lights off, as though it was dreaming of my return. I felt the low rumble of the engine sync with the watch on my wrist, a steady reminder that time waits for no one. I drove through quiet streets, past the diner that used to be our late-night refuge, and the park where we walked hand in hand. Each landmark flicked past the window like a silent witness to the unraveling of a decade. When I reached the highway's entrance ramp, I pressed my foot to the gas pedal, feeling the car surge forward, as though it too was eager for a fresh horizon. The sky was beginning to pale at the edges with the promise of dawn, but I welcomed the early light. I thought of the cabin I had reserved in Maple Creek, a place of solitude where I could breathe again. I imagined waking up surrounded by pine trees, the first sip of coffee warming my hands without the weight of expectation. In that vision, I saw a version of myself unburdened by indifference, a self who mattered not because someone else noticed, but because he chose to be seen. As the interstate stretched before me, I felt the friction of old bonds unravel, replaced by the wild possibility of new paths. I glanced down at the watch on my wrist, its second hand ticking decisively onward, and smiled. I had followed the protocol I designed for my own escape. I had packed my essentials, left my testament, and vanished without a trace. No texts, no goodbyes, just the quiet knowledge that the man who walked out that door would never walk back into that life, not as the husband I used to be, but as someone reborn by his own will. And with that realization, I pressed on, the road unspooling ahead like a promise. This was no escape, but the first chapter of the life I was finally ready to claim. The first morning in Maple Creek, I woke to a silence so profound it felt like an embrace. No toys strewn across the floor, no muffled arguments drifting through thin walls, only the gentle hiss of wind through pine needles and the low murmur of a creek winding nearby. I peeled back the threadbare quilt in the cabin's single bedroom and slid out of bed, letting bare feet press into the cool wooden floor. I padded to the small window and parted the curtain, drinking in the view. Tall trees standing sentinel over a carpet of moss and fallen leaves, sunlight streaming in scattered beams that danced on the cabin's weathered porch. For the first time in months, I felt unhurried. Breathing in the crisp air, I allowed myself a slow smile, imagining this pristine quiet as the first page of my new story. Down the narrow steps, I found a kettle already warmed on the wood stove, its whistle breaking the hush. I measured coffee grounds with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a thrill I hadn't felt in years. As the rich aroma filled the tiny kitchen, I rummaged through a borrowed drawer for a chipped mug. Each clink of porcelain against wood brought a sense of ceremony to the simple act of making coffee. I lifted the mug to my lips, feeling the heat seep into my fingers, and took a deliberate sip. No cream, no sugar. Just the raw bitterness and strength I needed to wake fully to myself. I spent the next hour unpacking the rest of my belongings, the chisel and hammer I'd buried among the papers in my duffel bag, my father's engraved watch now snug on my wrist, and a dozen journals brimming with my thoughts. I arranged them on a rough-hewn table in the corner, creating a small altar to this phase of my life, proof that I existed outside of the roles others had assigned me. As I set each item down, a weight lifted from my chest, replaced by an invigorating lightness. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a canvas, stretching out before me, waiting for me to leave my mark. With coffee in hand, I stepped outside onto the porch and surveyed the property. Silas Boone's cabin was modest, a single loft bedroom, a wood stove for heat, and a lean-to where I could stack firewood. Beyond that, a 5-acre stretch of forest beckoned. I remembered Silas's gruff instructions, "Make yourself at home, son. Just mind the creek in spring." I wasn't sure what he meant by the creek stirring, but I liked that he trusted me without preamble. I set my mug on the railing and inhaled deeply, allowing the scent of pine and earth to fill my lungs. No deadlines. No demands. Only the promise of solitude. I retrieved my laptop and perched on a fallen log a few yards from the porch, logging into the freelance platform where I'd lined up editing gigs. I opened the first manuscript, an aspiring novelist's dream of redemption, and dove into the prose. With each sentence I refined, I felt my confidence rebuild. My fingertips flew over the keys as though we were old partners, translating rough drafts into smoother, more resonant narratives. Time slipped away unnoticed. When I looked up, the sun was lower, painting the trees in gold. I closed the laptop, proud of the day's work. 2 short stories, a cover letter for a graduate student, and a chapter of a memoir that made me ache to read. As evening approached, the temperature dropped swiftly. I gathered firewood from the lean-to, stacking planks and branches in a neat pile. The wood stove glowed orange when I returned, casting flickering shadows across the cabin's wooden beams. I pulled my gray sweater tighter around my shoulders, my favorite from home, now imbued with fresh meaning, and settled into a worn armchair. The journals sat close by, and I opened the newest one, its pages blank but heavy with potential. I uncapped a pen and let the words flow. Observations about the trees, the way light fractured through branches, the strange comfort of knowing I answered to no one but myself. My script curved across the paper like the creek I could almost hear beyond the walls. Later, I stood on the porch under a sky spangled with stars, the Milky Way stretching like a river of light overhead. The cold air bit at my cheeks, so I wrapped my arms around my chest and closed my eyes. I thought of the life I left behind, of silences more deafening than any argument, of indifference so potent it erased me. Yet here, in the stillness, I felt seen for the first time in years. I wasn't invisible. I existed, and that existence felt revolutionary. When I returned inside, I made a simple dinner. canned chili heated on the stove, and a slice of bread toasted over the open flame. I ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. I realized that survival, unadorned by drama or derision, was an act of courage in itself. When the stove's embers glowed low, I climbed the ladder to the loft, laying out my quilt atop the mattress. I placed my watch on the bedside crate and slid between the covers, feeling the cotton sheets cool against my skin. My last thought before sleep claimed me was that I had traded a life of indifference for one of intention. Tomorrow, I would journal again, work on more manuscripts, perhaps explore deeper into Maple Creek's trails. For now, I let the quiet cradle me, a lullaby of leaves and water carrying me into a sleep I earned with every conscious breath of peace. Almost a year had passed since I closed the door on that life, 12 months of silence so profound I sometimes forgot I had ever existed anywhere but Maple Creek. I'd told myself I wouldn't look back, that I would burn the bridge and never glance at the ashes. But late one night, restless and craving a tether to the world I'd left behind, I logged into an old email account I'd nearly forgotten. I tapped the password with a pulse of nostalgia and opened the inbox to find a folder I never expected. Talia. My heart lurched when I saw the number beside it, 42 unread messages. A cold thrill ricocheted through me, equal parts dread and curiosity. I hesitated for a moment, fingers hovering above the first email, before steeling myself and clicking open. The subject line was simple: "You're a coward." The sender date was 6 months ago. I read the body, a single sentence in all caps: "How dare you abandon your wife?" My stomach clenched. The message buzzed with rage, so vivid I could almost feel the tremor in her voice. I slid to the edge of my chair in the cramped cabin office, raw wood against my back, and opened the next. "I hope you're happy leaving me here with her and the kids," it read, punctuation stabbing at the screen like shards of glass. The next 10 emails were similar, angry, accusatory, sometimes cruel. They painted me as the villain in a drama I had no script for. With each scroll, I felt the old wound's pulse, but I kept going. I needed to understand the extent of this rupture. About 20 emails in, the tone began to shift. The subject lines lost their rage. "We're behind on payments, Raina took the kids, I didn't know things were this bad." Her words trembled with desperation. She wrote that the house was sinking under expenses, mortgage notices arriving with scathing interest penalties. She begged for help she knew she didn't deserve. I closed my eyes against the sting of guilt. I had imagined her fine. Her sister a champion handling everything, her bright laughter echoing down the halls. But these messages revealed a woman drowning in fear and regret. One email read, "I had to ask Raina to leave. I'm alone. Please come back." The ache in her voice was a distant echo of the bond we once shared, and I found my chest tightening as though I were breathing through cotton. I clicked forward, and the letters grew quieter still. Apologetic. A simple subject. "I finally get it." The body said, "You weren't cold. You were tired." She confessed that she'd never considered how her silence had wounded me, how her indifference had felt like abandonment. My breath caught as I read the words, the neat lines of text softening the rage of months past. Another email arrived with the subject, "You were the last person who ever tried to hold this family together." I sat back, letting the weight of her honesty settle over me. It felt like an invitation, tentative and fragile, to close a chapter one thought had slammed shut forever. One message came with an attachment. Photographs of an empty living room, Talia standing alone in the doorway, light spilling over her face, shadows dancing across the floor where our wedding photo once stood. The image cut deeper than any words could. I stared at her face, eyes red-rimmed and distant, and felt a pang of something between sorrow and relief. She had taken the pictures after Raina left, after the kids were gone. She documented the emptiness she had once filled with her own laughter. In that ghostly frame, I recognized the home I abandoned, transformed into a shell of loss. The final email arrived just that morning. The subject read only, "One last thing." I hesitated before opening it, as though the final act would seal my fate. The message was short, "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you until the silence got too loud." Nothing more. No pleading. No recrimination. A quiet confession, weighty and sincere. I let the cursor hover and closed my eyes, considering whether to reply. 1,000 responses flitted through my mind. Warnings, absolutions, refusals, invitations, but none felt sufficient. I realized that silence had become my language, that absence my answer. Still, I saved that last message to my desktop as though it were a talisman. I powered down the laptop and stood in the cabin, listening to the wood stove's dying embers hiss. The universe felt full of possibilities I'd almost forgotten: reconciliation, forgiveness, peace. But another truth stood clearer than ever. I had changed. The man Talia once knew, the one who stayed and begged for a place at her table, no longer existed. I'd reclaimed myself, learned to stand alone without drifting into the shadows. My disappearance had been an answer to a silence that spoke louder than any argument or plea, and now I realized that her words, even an apology, could not undo the resolve I found in absence. I closed the cabin door behind me and stepped onto the porch, phone in hand, the last email's light glowing like a fragile promise. I inhaled the crisp night air, the smell of pine and loam grounding me where no email or letter could. In that moment, I understood that closure wasn't a door to walk through, but a mirror to look into, one that reflected the man I had become. And as I stared into that mirror, I saw myself clearly, a man who disappeared not out of cowardice, but to rediscover what was already missing. A week after that unexpected surge of old emails, I found myself lingering at the counter of Maple Creek's only coffee shop, savoring the quiet murmur of conversation around me. I had bumped into Grant, an old college friend who still lived in town, and we'd traded stories over steaming mugs of espresso that tasted like nostalgia. The roadside sign squeaked as a customer left, and through the window, I watched the sun play across the tops of pine trees. It felt like the world beyond my cabin had softened, opened up to me again. I laughed freely at Grant's jokes, the sound echoing in my ears like something I thought I'd forgotten. Then, as we rose to leave, he gave me a curious look and said, "Be careful out there, man. Some doors don't always stay closed." I shrugged it off with a grin, but the words buzzed in my mind long after I drove home. Later that afternoon, I was sitting on my porch, legs propped on the railing, absently flipping through one of Talia's emails I had printed out, when a soft, deliberate knock rapped the door. My hand froze on the page, coffee halfway to my lips. The knock came again, steady, unhurried, unmistakable. My heart thudded against my ribcage as I stood and crossed the wooden plank floorboards toward the door. Through the small window pane, I saw a figure standing in the dappled light, shoulders hunched against the breeze. I brushed my fingers along the curtain thread and peered out. It was Talia. My breath caught in my throat. She looked smaller than I remembered, as though the weight of months had carved her down to this pale, fragile silhouette. Her dark hair tumbled around her face in waves of disarray, and her eyes, those familiar windows I used to read with ease, were rimmed with red and swollen from crying. She raised a hand as if to steady herself, and in that simple motion, I felt everything inside me lurch and reel. I pressed back the curtain, heart pounding, unsure whether to open the door or bolt to the back of the cabin and pretend I wasn't home. Instead, I crossed the threshold and unlocked the door, stepping aside as she eased in. The porch light flickered over her coat, and I noticed for the first time the small scuff on her shoe and the sheen of tears still clinging to her lashes. She stood in my living room, framed by the doorway, looking both triumphant and defeated. I could feel the years of silence stretched taut between us like a wire. She exhaled, a soft, shuddering sigh, and said, "I'm sorry." The words tumbled out in a rush, heavy with regret. "I didn't see it. I didn't hear you until the silence got too loud." I let her speak. For once, I didn't silence her with defensive walls or angsty retorts. I sat back on the edge of the couch, my boundary in this cabin-turned sanctuary, and watched the raw vulnerability in her posture. She cradled her coat close, arms folded, voice trembling as she traced invisible patterns on the hardwood floor with her gaze. She told me how lonely the house had become after Raina left, how every corner echoed with the absence of my laughter, my voice. She admitted how she woke up each morning and reached for my side of the bed, only to find it empty, and the emptiness had grown louder each day. She spoke of the divorce papers on the counter and the photograph I'd left behind, the honeymoon snapshot that haunted her fridge, and how seeing that smiling version of me broke something open inside her chest. Her words were soaked in remorse, in hindsight's bittersweet clarity. She confessed that she'd never realized how her absence had wounded me, how her silence had been the sharpest cut. She said she had tried to fill the hours with work, with caring for the kids, with any distraction that could silence the guilt. She described nights when she curled into our daughter's old blanket, clutching it like a lifeline, wishing she'd paid attention to the man who once meant everything to her. She ended with a whisper, "I wanted to tell you sooner, but I didn't know how." When she paused, tears glistening on her cheeks, I rose and stood across from her. I saw the echoes of the woman I once loved, the compassion, the fierce loyalty, but I also saw someone transformed by regret, shaped by mistakes too long ignored. I took a breath and said, "Thank you for coming." My voice sounded foreign, resonating in the stillness. I could feel the pulse in my throat, the gravity of this moment drawing us close, rewiring our past with the electricity of truth. She waited, eyes fixed on the top of my gray sweater, as if she sought proof that I had indeed become someone new. I ran my fingers over the soft knit and squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, feeling the depth of my own change. When I opened them, I looked at Talia with calm certainty and said, "I'll come back, but only to finish what we started." My words hung in the air, deliberate and resolute. "I'll sign the last papers, but I can't be your husband again. That version of me doesn't exist anymore." She nodded, quietly. No tears fell then, only a slow, steady understanding that crossed her face like dawn. She understood that the man she once knew, silent, overlooking his own needs, bound by the gravity of a failing marriage, was gone. In his place stood someone who vanished to rediscover himself, and now claimed a new version, unscarred by indifference. She exhaled, a small shudder of acceptance, and placed a trembling hand over my father's watch glinting at my wrist. "I know," she said softly. "I know." And in that moment, I saw in her eyes not just remorse, but a spark of relief, as if the weight she carried had been passed on to me, and I was strong enough now to bear it. The silence that followed was not empty, but alive with possibility. The possibility of closure, of finality, of a farewell without bitterness. Talia stood there, fragile yet resolute, and I realized that love's end need not be a battle. It could be a shared acknowledgement of who we were and who we had become apart. I guided her to the door, and she paused on the threshold, as if to imprint this place in her memory. She looked back at me, the cabin's warm light catching the tears on her cheeks. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps fading down the porch steps. I closed the door gently and leaned against it, closing my eyes as the last click resonated through the hallway. The knock that took my breath had brought more than apology, it brought clarity. And as I stood there in the quiet aftermath, I knew that this chapter had closed, making space for whatever came next. Back in the city, the bright lights and the familiar hum of traffic felt surprisingly intrusive. I hunted down Talia at the lawyer's office, a modest building tucked between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner, its windows reflecting the morning rush. The waiting room smelled faintly of old leather and paper, and I sat on one of the vinyl chairs tapping my fingers against the armrest. Each tap echoed like a countdown, time until I faced the final act of our shared story. When my name was called, I rose, smoothing the front of my button-down shirt, and stepped into the office where Talia stood by the window, silhouetted against the light. She turned, meeting my eyes with a mixture of relief and sorrow. I nodded once, a small gesture of solidarity, and took the seat across from her. The lawyer, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a calm voice, placed a manila folder on the desk between us. I recognized the crisp pages inside, the divorce decree, the property division, the final signatures that would sever our legal ties. Talia bit her lower lip and let out a slow breath. I watched her hand hover over the pen, the muscle in her jaw tightening. She glanced at me, as though searching for permission or absolution. I met her gaze evenly and said, "When you're ready." My voice was steady, void of anger or regret, only acceptance. She exhaled again and reached for the pen. The scratch of ink on paper sounded louder than any argument we'd ever had. As she signed, her hand trembled, and for a moment I wanted to reach across the desk and steady it. But I held back, knowing that every move toward comfort would blur the lines we both needed to maintain. When she passed the folder across, our fingers brushed briefly, sending a small pulse through me, less shocking than comforting, a reminder of the life we once shared. I took the folder and signed the final line, closing the chapter with a crisp exhale. We stood and exchanged a polite nod. No tears, no raised voices, just the quiet understanding that this was necessary. Talia's eyes met mine one last time, conveying a complex blend of gratitude, sorrow, and relief. "Goodbye, Marcus," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the hush of the office. I answered with a simple, "Goodbye, Talia," and stepped around the desk to the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back and saw her shoulders slump, the light in her eyes flicker like a candle about to go out. I closed the door gently, the slight click resonating in the silent room. Outside, the parking lot was sun-baked and buzzing with cars. I spotted Raina standing by her sedan, arms crossed, shielding her eyes from the glare. Her expression was one of astonishment, and something darker, perhaps guilt or realization. As I walked toward her, she straightened, shifting on her heels in awkward anticipation. "So the ghost finally returns," she said softly, voice laced with irony that failed to carry its usual edge. I stopped a few feet away, the folder tucked under my arm. I let her gaze settle on me, meeting it without flinching. The years of being relegated to a punchline or an afterthought fell away, leaving only the person I rediscovered in Maple Creek. I folded my arms and looked her in the eyes. "You were never funny," I said quietly, my tone calm but resolute. "You were just loud." Raina's mouth opened, then closed, as though she'd forgotten her next line. The moment stretched between us, an electric pause where roles reversed and power shifted. She swallowed, but no response came. I offered a small nod, acknowledging what needed no words. I was no longer the man she could mock with impunity. Then I turned and walked to my car, each step deliberate, carrying the weight of finality. As I settled into the driver's seat, I pressed the folder against the passenger door, feeling its reassuring bulk. I closed my eyes for a moment and inhaled deeply, the scent of leather and asphalt mingling with a sense of closure. The engine's rumble seemed like a heartbeat, steady and persistent. I shifted into gear and backed out of the parking spot, the car rolling smoothly onto the street. The city skyline rose ahead, a jagged horizon of glass and steel that once symbolized the life I'd built. Now it represented a crossroad, no longer a trap but an invitation. I felt neither regret nor longing. Instead, I carried a quiet confidence born of having reclaimed myself. I glanced at the folder on the seat beside me and ran my fingertips over its edge. Within those papers lay not just an end, but the freedom to shape whatever came next. The road ahead was unfamiliar, but I welcomed the uncertainty. As I navigated the city streets, the morning sun glinted off the windows of high rises, and I realized that closure isn't a door to walk through but a mirror to look into, one that reflects not where you've been, but who you've become. And in that reflection, I recognized a man who disappeared to remember himself, and who closed a chapter not to imprison the past, but to free the future. With each turn of the steering wheel, I drove toward that promise, confident that the life waiting beyond the mirror would be the one I chose to live. If you're reading this and feel like wallpaper in your own life, constantly observed but never acknowledged, then know that you're not alone. I've stood in that exact spot, blending into the background as though I were a shade of paint on dull walls, my presence so unremarkable that no one noticed when I faded away. At Talia's barbecue, Jasper's toast, that cruel declaration that the world wouldn't blink if I vanished, wasn't meant for me alone. It was for every person who's ever felt the sting of indifference, every soul who wonders if they matter beyond fleeting convenience. When laughter follows you like a spotlight, only to ignore you the moment you look, that laughter becomes a reminder of the emptiness inside. But here's the truth. You don't need permission to reclaim your peace. You don't need anyone's understanding to walk away from the cold indifference they cloak in jokes and silence. I didn't leave because I wanted revenge or to make them pay. I left because I needed to remember who I was before their apathy defined me. Talia didn't cheat, and she didn't raise her voice once. She simply stopped trying, and that subtle withdrawal was more painful than any betrayal. Raina didn't demolish my marriage, she merely exposed its fractures, the faults already embedded deep inside. I could have stayed and begged for affection, pleaded for recognition, and tried to fill the cavernous hole her absence carved. Instead, I packed my bags, closed the door, and let the click of the latch echo my decision. I would vanish not to punish them, but to find myself again. In that disappearance, I discovered that absence can be as powerful as presence, a catalyst that can either destroy or rebuild. I chose the latter. For months, I lived in Maple Creek, surrounded by pine-scented air and the gentle murmur of the creek that wound through the forest like a living metaphor. Every day I woke to the question, who am I without their gaze defining me? I answered by writing, editing manuscripts, and carving words into journals until the shape of my own story emerged. I learned that the most valuable relationships are those we have with ourselves, how we treat our own hopes, how we honor our own needs. And I realized that the power to vanquish invisibility lies not in proving our worth to others, but in recognizing it within ourselves. When you raise your hot dog over that picnic table, as I did in the face of mockery, you aren't just dining, you're issuing a challenge to the world. I exist, and I matter. That simple gesture, an absurd yet defiant salute, became my emblem of self-worth. The hot dog, after all, was an object of ridicule, something mundane and ordinary. Yet in that moment, it was transformed into a scepter, a proclamation that I would no longer allow others to dictate my value. Every bite I took reminded me that I owned my story, that indifference would no longer write my lines. When you feel unseen, find your hot dog. It might be a crumpled notebook, a whispered laugh in the mirror, or the decision to close the front door behind you and never look back. Whatever it is, raise it high and let its ordinariness be your revolution. In the echo of your challenge, you will hear the first notes of your own song. I didn't disappear to punish Talia or Reina. I left so I could rediscover the person I had become in my absence. If you're holding your own hot dog, whatever symbolizes your willingness to defy neglect, then let this be your sign to act. You don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't need to wait for an apology or the shifting of affections. In stepping away, you declare your independence from the gravity of others' perceptions. You step into the fullness of your own narrative. And when you turn your back on those who treated you as afterthought, you open the door to connections based on genuine regard, rather than fragile obligation. So, for the ones who tread that narrow line between visibility and invisibility, I say this: disappearing is not an escape. It's the beginning of being seen. It's the bold refusal to let someone else script your existence. And in the space you carve out for yourself, you rediscover the shape of your own voice, the weight of your own presence, and the depth of your own worth. Raise your hot dog, whatever that symbol may be, and say, "Challenge accepted." Then go forward, head held high, and watch as the world finally takes notice of the person you always were. You don't need their permission to be seen. You only need the courage to step out of the background and into your own story.